You know, it's been described as a crime almost too terrible to be true. And as we know, the primary targets of this unspeakable crime against humanity have been largely Falun Gong practitioners. Although there's evidence, and your paper has been one of those to bring it forward, that they are also beginning to target Uyghur Muslims for this indescribably evil practice. But yes, we would view it as very much intersecting with the denial of freedom of religion, because the forces in communist China that are driving this grisly, gruesome, awful industry, if you will, target religious minorities like the Falun Gong, like the Uyghur Muslims, for two reasons. First, to terrorize the minorities, and as another vicious means of, murder and persecution, but also because, ironically, they, especially with the Falun Gong, they tend to live very healthy lifestyles. And because this is an industrial scale harvesting of organs for commercial purposes, basically, they are very interested in getting organs from those whose lifestyle is such that, they're likely to be healthy inside and out. And it is, as I say, an unimaginable crime. I was very grateful to Chairman McCall for raising it from the plenary stage. It has not been talked about enough. It's a cause I've been engaged in for quite some time. And, I'm very alarmed and kind of sickened at the way some of our top medical institutions, medical schools, have been willing to accept China's denial of responsibility for this and their false assurances that the practice has stopped. There are just some clearly absurd statistics that make it quite clear that they are not telling the truth about this. I know China has talked about establishing now a volunteer organ donor registry. We've had that for many, many years in the United States, and I believe, if my numbers are correct, we have about 140 million voluntary organ donors in the United States. Those are folks who on their driver's license say, yes, if I'm in an accident, I want my organs to be used to assist somebody else medically. Well, with a huge number of voluntary organ donors in this country, we have enormous waiting lists. Many people pass away because organs don't become available in a timely fashion. That's just the nature of this, and one of those aspects of life that we have to contend with. China, by comparison, a country of over 1 billion people, has about 1 million. So a tiny fraction of the number that we have here in the United States on their so-called voluntary organ donor list. And yet, somehow, in China, organs can be almost ordered up within a couple of weeks. The numbers simply don't add up. And so I am very disappointed in medical institutions and others who, with an inexcusable level of naivete, seem to be accepting some of China's claims about having, reformed their practices. They have not. They have not. And the best evidence is that there are still tens of thousands of organs being illegally harvested in China annually. My hope is that as we raise the profile of this crime, as the world becomes increasingly less intimidated by China's sort of size and wealth and starts telling the truth and calling China out, it will increase the pressure on that government. It's dictatorships like China that are terrified of acknowledging their own flaws and shortcomings. And that's why they have to attack dissidents, human rights advocates, groups like the Falun Gong that sort of teach principles of compassion and justice and kindness and forgiveness. All of these are a threat to a brutal dictatorship. My hope would be that as you have more prominent and, quite frankly, powerful individuals like the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee drawing attention to this issue. Perhaps hearings will follow in the United States Congress. These shine a light, and shining a light is a kind of disinfectant. It begins to bring the light of truth, the light of day, the light of exposure to practices, and we have to hope that it will lead to change on the ground in China.
When I'm thinking about hearings, I can't help but think about your father, who chaired, I don't know how many hearings specifically focused on human rights issues, and he was unapologetic in holding people to account. And he, of course, was a Holocaust survivor, as was actually, as many of our viewers know, my father-in-law. And so here's something I've actually wanted to ask you for some time. My wife had this moment in her life where she really fully grasped what it was that her father had experienced. And at this moment, this changed her and gave her more motivation in her life. Did you have such a moment? Do you remember such a moment?
Well, I remember a number of moments in our childhood, my sisters and my childhood. My father did not talk about his experiences during that dark time. I think that's not uncommon. Those were painful times and difficult things to remember. But when we were still quite young, my parents, both of them, began telling us about sort of a light that shone in the darkness, and that was the Swedish humanitarian Raoul Wallenberg. So my parents' lives were in different ways saved by Wallenberg. My father had escaped from a slave labor camp. He was able to make his way back to Budapest, and he found refuge in one of the safe houses that Raoul Wallenberg had set up in Budapest. He was sent to Hungary after the occupation by the Germans with really just one mission, and that was to try and rescue and save as many of the innocent Jews as possible. So one of the things that Wallenberg did was he rented a number of buildings around Budapest, apartment buildings and others, hung the Swedish flag there, basically said these are now part of the Swedish legation and they are off limits to the Nazis and to the Hungarian Arrow Cross. Now, when we say safe houses, you have to do it a little bit in quotes, because whenever the quotas were not being met for deportations, they would sometimes raid these safe houses and march the residents off to the train stations and deport them. Whenever news of that reached Wallenberg's ears, he would race to that place and personally confront the German commander and say, these people are under my protection, this is part of the Swedish legation, you're violating diplomatic laws and immunities, and many times he was able to save those people. But it was very touch and go. My mother, she was saved because Wallenberg was able to engage other members of the diplomatic corps to follow his example in issuing, they were sometimes called Schutzpasses, protective passports. These were documents that basically said that the individual carrying it, either that they were a citizen of a country that they were not a citizen of, or they were under the protection of that country and had been given permission to emigrate. My mother and her mother were able to escape with a Portuguese protective passport, and that was sort of following the example of Wallenberg. So we were very fortunate, because even though they had experienced terrible things, they also said to us there was a light that shone in the darkness. My mother would tell us we called Wallenberg our Moses from the north, who had come to save us and lead us to the promised land. And so from a young age, both my sister and myself, we knew the stories of danger and of terror, but that someone had come to help.